And welcome everybody back to the Eyes Open podcast interviews. And today we have an amazing guest on the show, Mr. Kevin Annett. But what I'm going to do, as always, I'm going to let him introduce himself for the people that do not know him and his work. Thanks for being in studio today, Kevin. We really appreciate it a lot. So I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thanks, Elias. Appreciate being on. I'm on the road right now, obviously. So my background is for the last 30 years, I began to work as a Protestant minister on the west coast of Canada. I began to encounter a lot of children going missing and a whole history of on the west coast. A lot of the native people had been wiped out by a whole combination of usual church and state cabal. I made an issue of it and found after a couple of years as minister, I was shown the door very quickly when I began to uncover land deals going on, grabbing native land, making a lot of people going missing. Over 60,000 native children had died in these Indian schools. They called them schools, but they're really internment camps. And we began a whole campaign about that. Invariably, it led to all sorts of other issues. When I got invited to Europe, we began to work with people tracing these crimes, of course, to the Vatican and the Crown of England, where a lot of it began. And we began a whole movement to not only prosecute church and state for these crimes, but create our own courts, because you couldn't use the existing system to put the system on trial. So we sparked with the conviction of Pope Benedict in 2013, and we helped force him out of office. This whole common law movement began spreading all over the world, and it's really mushroomed into a whole movement for sovereignty now. One of my recent books, Governing Ourselves, kind of lays out how we need a broader approach to these systemic crimes, looking at the source of them, and how the people have to take power back into their own hands, setting up their own courts, their own assemblies. Really struck a chord in the post-COVID era when the whole tyrannical corporate agenda is coming down in a big way. And so we're really an international movement now, helping people, reclaim their innate sovereignty, which Americans are taught is theirs by birth, right? And so, it's led me into a lot of interesting situations, but you can see a lot of that online, murderbydecree.com, which is a website with a lot of the hard evidence of that genocide we first documented and, led to these other campaigns we're now involved in.
So, what led you to? We'll start kind of from the beginning. What led you into ministry? Like, what led you down that path to get into the ministry?
I didn't go into the ministry till I was 30. I had been, as a young man, I very interested in the underdog. I was involved in a lot of different political campaigns in that, but I was personally kind of searching for more than that. I was teaching political science and anthropology, and then I thought, well, no, I wanted to go deeper than that. And I guess I had a spiritual yearning, kind of naively and stupidly. I equated that with going into church ministry. And so maybe, it's part of my purpose to get into that situation, because as an insider in the United Church of Canada, I began to learn these things. It was quite blatant. I remember my first week at St. Andrew's United Church on Vancouver Island. That's right on the west coast of Canada. And I was there with my young family. We had two young daughters at the time. And the very first native home I went to, they told me stories about children being killed and buried in behind the school by the church staff and ministers and priests who'd shown up. And it was true in the Catholic and the Anglican schools as well. This was a massive genocide. And I was told to shut up about it, right? And my natural kind of inclination to not, my unwillingness to look the other way, it caused the church to go to my wife at the time and say, we're going to make sure this guy never works again. If you want to leave him, nudge, nudge, we'll help pay for your divorce, which they did. And at that point, I realized, okay, we're onto something much bigger, because you don't do that to somebody unless, they're, it's the standard whistleblower treatment. And everything I'd prepared for in my life up to then, there was nothing I had in my arsenal which mentally prepared me for what was coming down. And that's why you have to learn from experience on these things. But I have that kind of persistent quality. When I see a wrong, I just don't look the other way. I don't let go. And that led me into a lot of personal suffering, but also won me trust among a lot of the native people and others, and it's how we began to build this whole movement. So you can almost say it was, a destiny, I think, because the way things were happening one after another wasn't accidental. I think there was a whole hidden hand at work, kind of guiding me down certain paths.
So, in a sense, not just in the church that you were with when you started noticing these things going on, when kind of did the veil get lifted for you? Like, what was that point in your life when you started seeing, we all have that moment where,
Yeah.
it's everything's not what we told it's been. Like, when was that kind of for you in your life when you're like, I see things that aren't really what we're being told they
Yeah.
are?
Well, like a lot of us, when it hit me personally, I talk about that moment in my documentary film Unrepentant, which is it's one of the things that forced out this issue, and I think it's listed in some of my links there. Anyway, in the film, I say I couldn't understand why the church went after me like so brutally. But when I saw what they had done, how they'd gone to my ex-wife, how they deliberately stripped my children away from me and made it impossible for me to work simply because I was talking about their dirty laundry that they eventually had to admit anyway, right? When I saw that they could do that to their own, I remember writing in my journal, um, if they could do that to me, imagine what they could do to a native child who wasn't part of their church, wasn't a Christian, who stood on land and resources they wanted. Naturally, they could kill them. They're those kind of people because I felt their ire and their destruction personally, and I think that's really important because when we don't experience something personally, it's kind of abstract. You can take it or leave it, you know. But when it's hit you, you can't deny the fact that the society is brutal. When you step on their interests, when you step on their big money, when you step on vested interests, you become a walking target. And when you know that from your personal life, it's not abstract anymore. You realize, okay, this is a fight to the death, and I'm not backing down. And when people do that, you have enormous power, and we can move mountains as we've done over 30 years in this work just by not giving up, staying on what you know is right. You know.
So what was your first step? Like once you had realized what was going on, what was one of the big major first steps that you took in the direction of exposing this and really like you said, starting to move the mountain?
Well, it was I was fortunate because there were a lot of eyewitnesses to these crimes, a lot of Native people um, who who had the evidence. And it was funny the way things happened. I get thrown out of the church. I go to the University of British Columbia, where I got my degrees. I tried to retrain. The church blocked that. They stopped funding for my doctoral program with people they knew at the university. And at the same time, Native people had heard my story and they began inviting me down. This was in the mid 1990s. They invited me to their local, they called them talking circles, where they would share what had happened to them. And in the university library, I found that same year they had acquired all of the records, microfilmed records from these Indian schools. And give you an example, I found a record where dentists were being paid to pull out the tooth of native children without painkiller, deliberately, as punishment, as to terrorize them. And there in the healing circle, one of the native people described that happening to them at a young age. So they were traumatized. They could never go to a dentist after that or a doctor. And people wonder, well, why are your teeth falling out? Well, because they ripped them out at a young age, some of them, right? So that we take the documentary evidence, put it alongside the eyewitness. That's all you need in a court of law. And that was the power of what we're doing. We had the witnesses, we had the evidence, we even had remains. We dug at various mass graves and found the bones of children. They turned out to be children's remains. All of that, of course, censored in the so-called mainstream media. So we were like this real guerrilla movement, but we were really worrying the churches and government. We began to hold protests at the churches. Over a period of about 10 years, we finally forced out the pseudo apology in 2008, but there was an enormous cover up of all of this stuff. There still is. And I think it was working on the ground. I mean, to answer your question, it was working on the ground, seeing the living witnesses of this, and realizing that we can't just stay silent. We can't just talk about the problem. We've got to confront these churches, and that's what we began to do. Literally going in on a Sunday morning and standing there during their service with our banners about the missing children. That caused an enormous explosion across the country when they hit the press, and it really began to. It forced them, like one of the literally within a month of us starting to occupy churches, the government was pressured by the all the churches to issue, to start a pseudo investigation into these things to take the heat off them. So we found that direct action always works, right?
And what you were saying as far as like pulling the teeth out and stuff, it kind of was something I was interested in because I don't think people understand this enough. How this it doesn't only exist in society, but it exists um like trauma-based mind control is real. Like a woman who will be
Right.
traumatized by a husband to stay with him or certain. So it's like it's a thing that people think isn't real, but it's very real. So do you think this type of trauma-based mind control like was a big factor in keeping these kids
Oh yeah.
silent and people silent?
It was the whole purpose of the places. Now, don't forget, if people look at all the evidence we have at murderbydecree.com, there's a PDF of my book because the book itself, it's like enormous, 500 pages stacked with evidence we accumulated, eyewitness testimonies, government archival records showing that the death rate in these places was over 50% every year for over half a century. So you don't have half the children dying off every year, and unless it's deliberate. And there was a guy, Dr. Peter Bryce, who did a tour of the residential schools in the West in the early part of the 20th century. And he said they're deliberately creating the conditions to spread smallpox and tuberculosis. They put the healthy in with the sick, lock the doors, they're all dead. And then they can blame it as an act of nature. They all died of TB. Well, it was deliberate germ warfare to wipe out at least half of these children, get the lands and resources. And it's even said in church and government documents that's the point of these places. They're extermination centers. Now don't forget, they talk a lot about the Nazi Holocaust all the time. The death rate in Auschwitz was about 25% every year because these were work camps as well. Well, Auschwitz, Treblinka, these were slave labor camps, and they needed, laborers. The death rate in these Indian schools in America and Canada was over 50%, double the rate, because they were killing grounds. They would just bring in the children. They had a way, and I've talked to hundreds of survivors who describe this. It's like the selection process. The children shown up, the RCMP grab all the children out of the village, even the newborn babies. They grab all of them. They take them to these places. They select them. The kids who can work are shuffled one way. The ones who can be trafficked or who are too sick or young, they just kill them. The army would often pick them up and take them off. We had a woman in Ontario describing watching this. Canadian soldiers lining up Native children in front of a ditch and just shooting all of them in the 1940s. And we've even found the graves of this, the archival evidence and the forensic proof that all this happened, right? So, you know, that one fact, the death rate over half a century, nobody has ever commented on that. I mean, when I was at the university, I was the only scholar to even try to look at this stuff. The academia, the media, the government, the churches, none of them will ever address that simple fact. That's proof of intentional genocide. It's all buried down the memory hole, you know. And if you try speaking about it, you're instantly blacklisted. I had that. I was speaking to a group of teachers last year in Vancouver. They had invited me in, social studies teachers, to talk about this stuff. Within half an hour, the principal of the school shows up and tells me to leave because he says we had been warned by the Vancouver School Board not to let you speak. So it's coming from higher up. It isn't just some principal who doesn't like what I'm saying. It's an organized blacklisting, and this is like 30 years later. It's still going on. So it's not about just crimes of the past because it's still going on. The level of children being trafficked. The Chinese here in northern British Columbia bought up all the oil and natural gas. They're forcing a lot of native families off their land at gunpoint. There's a huge fight here over the resources. And I think, in fact, if there's going to be a shooting war between Trump and the Chinese, it's going to be right here over all the resources, especially with the talk about going into Greenland.
Oh yeah, you cut up there for a second. I got the last part you were talking about was Trump, like with Greenland. So it just cut out for just a second. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Did you hear everything I said, or should I repeat?
Yeah. So you were at the part where you said if a shooting war starts, it'll start right here with the Chinese, with them trying to Trump trying to acquire Greenland. So that's the last part everybody heard.
Yeah, I mean, there's in Alberta and British Columbia there's more natural gas and oil than almost anywhere in the world. The Arctic oil and gas, and the Chinese are switching from coal to liquid natural gas. So they bought up the whole country. Uh, the both Liberal and Tory governments have allowed them to even station their troops. There's Chinese troops operating only a couple of hundred miles from where I'm sitting, right? And so it's a big battle now, and you know it's part of that bigger struggle between Russia, China, and America now going on. But I mean, it's Native people stand in the way of that. So a lot of people go missing all the time down there.
And I think this will I think this will be an interesting thing that you because what I found out is you got to look at who you can't criticize, and that's who you know who's really running the show. Because I remember
Exactly.
when Bill Cooper called out Alex Jones for when he was on his show back before Bill Cooper, I think was assassinated. Um, he said he brought up the Vatican and he cut him right off the show because that's
Yeah.
when he knew. He came out and said, "Look, he's a shill because he won't let me talk about the Vatican." Now, I always found it interesting that I'm like, I think they're like ever since I was young, I've been studying conspiracy, so it's going on over 20 years now. I've been really studying this stuff, and I've always noticed, no matter what political party it is, they all go meet the Pope. And I'm like, why? These guys are clearly not Christians. So I've always seen how, like, almost like a Godfather scenario, they go and kiss the ring and go and meet with the
Right.
Pope. So it's like the saying, all roads, meet lead to Rome. So
Right.
what was that moment for you when you had seen with all this? Because this is huge, like what you're saying, that what you've witnessed all leads to the Vatican and Rome. So what was that moment when you had realized that?
Oh well, I mean, I saw it growing up in Winnipeg, central Canada. You know, the power the Catholic Church had there. They ran all the school boards. They ran, and our family were Presbyterian, so we never liked the Church of Rome. But I mean, working on the ground, most of these death camps that we call Indian schools, they're all run by the Catholics, the Catholic Church. And you got to watch out for the meaning of words because Catholic means universal. So it's not that, and it's really, I believe, the whole purpose of the Church of Rome was to create a full substitute, kind of an antichrist. And I've written a book about that, dethroning a rogue power, about the nature of the Vatican and its crimes, and I mean, one of the things we uncovered was this centuries-old cult called the Ninth Circle that operates in the Church of Rome, that every pope, every top cardinal has to be a member of. Child sacrificial cult, right? And we've had eyewitnesses. I know the people who've been raised intergenerationally in that cult, and that operates openly. And one of the other reasons, it isn't just because wanting to get Catholic voters at election time. That's not why politicians do it. It is because they're owned by them, bought and sold. To give you an example, one thing we discovered, Pope Francis, when he was still in, Jorge Bergoglio, he came to Canada in 2022, ostensibly to, issue an apology to all those little kids they slaughtered. But in fact, he met in Prince Rupert, which is right up the coast of British Columbia. It's on the way to Alaska. And he met with the Chinese and agreed, he and Petra Parolin, who's the Secretary of State, they agreed to underwrite the Chinese takeover to over $1 trillion every year, Vatican Bank money. Because don't forget, about 80% of all the bank deposits get channeled through the Vatican Bank and the Bank of International Settlements in Geneva. These are extraterritorial. They operate outside all laws. And it's got huge financial resources, like the Mormon Church. And they're partners, really, in many ways, those two. But they literally, when I remember the first time I was in Rome doing a protest at the Vatican, one of the politicians came to me and he said, you have to understand that every political party, major political party in every country in the world is funded out of the Vatican. They own the politicians. It's that simple. What do you think Francis was allowed to address both houses of Congress? I mean, separation of church and state. Did they bring the head mullah of the Muslim religion to address the state? No. And what's incredible about his performance there is he was arguing for the New World Order. He was talking about one world government, one world church, us. And then and this was especially disgusting when he was there, he beatified this Franciscan missionary, and that means he would turn into a saint. This guy called Junipero Serra in California. Well, Junipero Serra had worked to death over 100,000 California Indians on these Franciscan plantations. They were slave plantations. And Bergoglio stands up in Congress and says, we're inspired by his zeal. So it's like kill the unbelievers, and the so-called liberal Pope was saying that's a great thing. We're going to turn him into a saint for killing all those heathen Indians. So it's kind of like the mentality never changes, right? And the politicians and all that, all the legal court cases that are brought against child rapists, the attorney generals of both Republicans and Democrats have always done the same thing. They stop all legal action above the level of a priest. So you can only sue priests. You can't third party the Pope to come in because and one final point on this, there's a policy in the Catholic Church called Crimen Solicitatis, and it's been in place for over 100 years. It said every Catholic in the world, every priest, has to protect child rapists. If a child is harmed, the police are not to be told, and everyone is silenced. And if you talk about it, you're excommunicated. To them, that means being thrown into hell for snitching on a child rapist. And this conspiracy to protect child rapists, if they're allowed to operate that way by the government and the courts. So if that isn't, that's why we say church and state are really one. They're coming from the same beast. And it goes back 1,500 years to Rome, and it's still operating. So that's why people are going to kind of lose the fog around them about when it comes to religion. It's just a way to not only dupe people, but control them with the oldest empire on the planet. Right? The first corporation in history was the Church of Rome. Right? They set the model for everything.
Yeah, and see, that's what I think. It's amazing too, because see, there's people that I know have came out of the Catholic Church, became more Protestant. Like me myself, I'm a Christian. I would say of no denomination. I don't fall in line with that's why I get a lot of hate, because I'm critical of the Catholic Church of all. I don't believe I believe churches in general nowadays are businesses more than anything. We're not being spiritually fed like the Bible says you should be. So I catch a lot of flack for that. But I mean, I don't think enough people speak about the power that lies behind, and has for, like you said, a very long time behind, the Catholic Church. So let's go through a little bit when you were excommunicated. How did that process happen? Like, what did you uncover? When did they decide that, we're going to get him out? So what was that ordeal like?
Well, in the fall of 1994, I had been minister at St. Andrews for over 2 years, and I found out that there's a big land grab. The biggest logging company in the world, Weyerhaeuser, they're based in Seattle. They were buying up all these trees all over British Columbia, and the United Church was sitting on, my employer was sitting on all this old growth forest that their missionaries had grabbed and stolen, from the local native tribes. And they had done a secret deal. I found out about this from some of the local native elders because I was working a lot in the native communities, and they were telling me all this shit, not only about all the children who died, but all the land grabbing going on. I wrote a letter about it to the United Church, just citing our own policy, saying that our own policy says if you had native land that your missionaries have stolen, you're to return it to the original native people, right? As part of the compensation I was just citing on our policy. Next thing I knew, secret meetings start to have me removed. They got a call from Weyerhaeuser and the British Columbia government, who were shareholders of Weyerhaeuser, basically say, get rid of this guy and bury him so we can't ever talk about this. And they set up my secret firing in January 1995. They said, you're out. You've got to, even though you've got 2 children to raise, to support, you've got to have pastoral retraining for a year without pay and psychiatric evaluation.
Oh,
so
wow.
you got to, In other words, to admit that, well, I was a bit off my rocker there, don't take me seriously. So I wouldn't do that. They blackballed me. They funded my wife's divorce. She left with the kids on their payroll. It was an enormous shutdown on every front. And within a year, and it was funny the way it happened, on February 1st, 1996, the first lawsuits were announced against the churches for these residential school crimes. I had helped the first group of litigants sue the United Church. 2 days later, they vote to throw me out in a public defrocking. It had never happened before in United Church history to publicly defrock somebody. Normally, they like to keep their dirty laundry behind closed doors. And that's what reporters at the time, before the media was shut down on all this story, they were saying, why are they throwing this guy out of the church at a cost of $250,000 in public? Doesn't make any sense unless it's a show trial to make an example of him. Because they were worried the lawsuits had begun and more people were coming forward. I was like a thorn in their side in a big way. And so
they want to make an example out of you.
Pardon me?
They wanted to make an example out of you, like you were saying.
Absolutely. And not only there, I was trying to retrain at the university. They shut down my doctoral degree. They started a huge smear campaign on the university campus against me. I couldn't work, couldn't retrain. So I said, to hell with this. I took out my research and I just began working in the grassroots with the Native people. And that's over the years, we built up this movement that forced all this change. And so a really bad thing for me personally turned out to be a very good thing because it's the way this whole movement began. And so, I tried to turn lemons into lemonade, as they say. I tried to turn anything that comes at us, we can turn into an advantage if we stay on the truth. And I had a lot of help from the eyewitnesses. Now, of course, a lot of these people were targeted, being Native people. There were 7 Native people in Vancouver alone who were killed after getting involved in our campaign. And one of them, you might have heard the story of William Coombs. He saw Queen Elizabeth take 10 children out of the Kamloops death camp and the Catholic Indian school. And these kids were never seen again. William was coming to London, England to give testimony. The Mounties show up, take him to St. Paul's Hospital. He's dead within 48 hours. And the nurse who treated him said he had this symptoms of arsenic poisoning on his fingernails, not tuberculosis as they claim, right? Often the natives, they died of TB, right? He had none of the symptoms. They killed him in the hospital. And I mean, it's how you're able to, they're not citizens under the law, Native people still, so you can do whatever you want to them. Although these days they can do whatever they want to anybody. They don't play by their own rules anymore. But, the point is that we began to uncover all of this stuff and they didn't know what to do. That for years we had them on the run until they bought off a lot of the Native leaders to put in this big spin. And basically, 90% of what we've done is now being taken out of libraries, off the internet. It's just been a complete censoring of everything we achieved. Although they'll acknowledge children died, but they say, oh no, only a few hundred died. Well, we counted at least 50,000 over a century because the death rate was 50% every year. That's not, that creates tens of thousands of deaths, not a few hundred. Just do the math, right?
Yeah.
But people live under this big lie. When it's their genocide, it's like they'll never look at it. They can't. And unfortunately, now it's blowing back on us. So it's time to look at all this stuff, right?
So this is a deep question in a sense. I'm sure, I'm not going to make assumptions, but I'm sure, have you had death threats, like attempts on your life? That's, I could only imagine. Like, can you touch on that a little bit?
It's it tends to go up and down depending on how much exposure we get. They knew after a while that if you kill a guy like me, it's too obvious. Because I had a lot of exposure. I was a white professional, man. I'd been vocal. I knew from the beginning instinctively to stay public, because that's your best protection. If you're known, it's harder to bump you off. So I'd be dead if I was Native or somebody without as much exposure. I would have been dead years ago. But what they do instead is they don't want to create a martyr. They want to get everybody scared about the name Kevin Annett. And that's, in fact, what they've done very effectively in Canada. It's interesting when I look at my sales of books on Amazon, about 3/4 of the books I sell are from Americans and a lot in Europe. Only 6% of my books are sold in Canada. Now, that's weird because it's all about Canada. And yet the censorship And fear campaign, the fear and smear job they've done on me up here is extensive. And so even the latest generations of people, they kind of have been programmed to get wary about the name Kevin Annett. When you just look at the evidence, it's all I've all been vindicated and proven, and yet, you know, I guess it's easier to get people paranoid about one person than have them look at their own group crime, right?
So essentially, it was more so of discredit. They knew if they bumped you off, that'd be way too obvious. So they
Yeah,
figured it was better to shut you down.
there have been attacks a lot. I mean, I've been physically assaulted, the whole legal assault, um, bullets on my doorstep, especially on those visits I had with my children. They would tend to. We found a dead deer outside our door once with a bullet right through its head. Right, freaked out my daughters. I mean, it was designed to do that so they don't want to be around dad anymore because it's all that psychological warfare. Um, but no, yeah, it's like the way you deal with a whistleblower. One of the books I wrote is a whistleblower manual. I kind of compiled all my lessons about when you're up against a big institution, they can only react in certain ways, and you can outmaneuver them all the time, right? And that's your advantage when you don't give up and you're operating in a grassroots manner. So, you learn all these things over the years, and that's the advantage of never giving up. That you can be a resource for other people who are going through the same thing.
And as you were speaking on, because I have a lot of friends that are in Canada, and we used to talk all the time, like through Telegram. We have like Telegram chats, and everybody be talking. And a lot of them, some are from Alberta, some are on this side, that side, Montreal,
Mm.
and we were joking. It was around the time when Trump said that he was going to buy Canada and they were going to become, the 51st state. And they're like, oh man, we wish we want our guns back. And I remember talking to him. I said, what was that like? I said, you guys actually handed your guns over? He said, and one guy who was probably in his 50s that I know, he's like, oh yeah, I remember when it happened and they came and took my dad's guns. They made him destroy them, or they took them. And
Yeah.
it was profound to know that, at some point Canada was like us. You guys had firearms and all that. And I just know,
Yeah.
like, that's probably why Americans are so into your work and all that, is because we're waking up more than ever here in the States. Like, there's
Yeah.
been people think it's dying down, but it's actually waking up more. People are wanting to know the truth about what you're talking about, and these types of genocides and the cabal type stuff that's going on. We're wanting to know more. So I'd say there's more of a mass awakening than ever in the States.
There is, and as a matter of fact, on the first anniversary of Trump's inauguration on January 20th, there was a shutdown in the country. There was a group, whole network called Free America, and they just didn't go to work. They didn't buy stuff. They boycotted everything for a day to protest. But there was also a group that released a new Declaration of Independence, saying we're just not going to follow these executive orders. We're going to take back power in our communities, setting up our own constitutional conventions like they did in 1776. And so I see that everywhere now. And the thing about Canada is that we are a lot like Americans. In fact, we had an attempted uprising against the crown in 1837 that got crushed. And even a lot of Canadians don't know their own history, but it was in what's now Ontario and Quebec. Because the French in Quebec didn't like the British crown, and they got together with a lot of Americans that immigrated up into Ontario, and there wasn't really a border then. And actually, my great 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 grandfather took part in the rebellion,
Oh wow.
full of Annett. He was a Baptist, and you see, they had got forced out of England because of being Baptist. And when you came to Canada, every seventh uh, section of land was owned by the Church of England. It's called the Clergy Reserve, and they stopped people. You had to pay to support the Church of England, even if you weren't an Anglican. And they owned all the land around you. So they said, "Tell with us," and they took up arms. And so, fortunately, he didn't get hanged, but a lot of people did. And it kind of, after that, they created this dictatorship of church and state, right? And it's one of the reasons you had this genocide, because uh, Canadians are taught in schools that you're a subject of the crown. That's the term they use. Subject of the crown. Like, no, since when did I ever agree to that? Right. But, I always hated that. I would never get the oath of allegiance to the crown ever. Um, That's why I couldn't go through law school, because I wouldn't do it, right? I had been in law school, but they required that, to enter the bar, you take this oath. And I wouldn't. So there's a lot of that resistance in Canada, but you don't tend to see that in the corporate media. It's this image of Canadians are all nice, which is the word nice actually in the Middle Ages meant stupid. That's where the word comes from. So
No, and see, we're dealing with it. That's why I catch a lot. I'm very controversial in the sense that I voted for Trump multiple times. I believed in all of that for a while, even though I didn't believe in voting. But it was about a year or so back I became critical of him because we're moving towards, we might as well have a crown, because at the point now, Trump's just moving around and whatever he wants to do, he's doing it.
well, it's like you said before, it's like it doesn't matter who you are. Once you get into power, no matter what your intention is, you play by the game, you know. And in America, it means not going up against the military-industrial system, because it's half the budget spent on this bloated military economy now. And you don't challenge the vested interest, and you all go to Rome, kiss the guy's ass. I mean, it's like,
Yep.
who needs that, right?
And that's pretty much what it is. I think it's like, as you had said, it's a cabal that they all have to be a part of. It's a big club,
Right.
and you either play by the rules, or my belief based on my research is the last person to act like they were going to play by the rules and didn't was Kennedy. And we know what happened to the Kennedys. They said, get us in, we'll play your game. And when they didn't play by that game, and he systematically tried to get rid of the CIA and the military industrial complex, all of a sudden, he gets bumped off.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's, and yet they still believe it was a lone gunman. It's that official lie that everyone, if you read 1984 by George Orwell, it's really brilliant, because he shows about all the mind control techniques. He said, if you can get people to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, then you have them for life, because your logic says, no, it's 4, but, it's kind of common sense tells you one thing, the state tells you another, and you go along with it even though it's a lie. I mean, that's that dissociated condition they keep everybody in.
Now, there's an experiment, speaking about that they ran and they proved it. I don't know what the name of it is. Maybe you'll know it. They put like 8 actors in a room, and one of them, it was like, or about 10 people, 9 of them were actors, 1 was a real person. And they would put all these things up on a board, and they'd say, okay, what's the longest line? And everybody would say the correct thing, and then they'd start to say the wrong thing. Everybody at some point, even though they could tell that line was shorter, they look around and they would say the same as everybody else, not to stand out. I forget what it is. It's like a collective, like
the herd impulse.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
They even call that big pharma, when they're pushing the drugs. They call it. They use that term a lot. Herd statistics. They refer to all of us as a herd, like we're being cattle. We're cattle in a pen, right? And it's similarly when you get people, you get a bunch of people in a room, and you still tell them to start walking in a circle. That's all you say. And after even a minute or less, everyone's walking in the same pace. The pace is the same, because there's kind of a instinctive thing among people. We're imitative, and we needed that in evolution to survive, right? But if you get a group of people together, if you notice how in a parking lot people all park together, you won't they'll be all over the place. Or in a movie theater, when you go in, people tend to congregate together in the middle. It's a rare person who goes sits off by themselves. That's our herd impulse, and they know how to milk that, right? We don't want to be alone. I think it's partly the fear of death and ending, and that we need each other, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing, right?
Well, see, they've ran experiments about this. There was one where they had these monkeys, and they had a banana, and the monkeys were trying to go for that banana until they shocked them enough times. And then for some reason, a new monkey came in. Even though the new monkey knew nothing of what was going on, it knew not to touch that banana without the other monkey saying nothing to it.
Right. Kind of the group mind, which is real. It's the brain isn't, the consciousness isn't just in the brain. There's this higher overmind. And hold on, ambulance. And in the Bible, they call it the angel. If you read the letters to the different churches in Paul's letters, he doesn't refer to the church in Ephesus. He says to the angel of the church of Ephesus, to the angel of the church of Smyrna, etc. Um, and that angel is the kind of the overmind, and everyone in power knows that if you can control that overmind, you've got everybody, pretty much. There's sometimes about 2% of people can't be assimilated into the group mind. It's a very small number. The 98% can be easily if you control
Collective consciousness,
that
in a sense.
yeah, like and the way you find that is common sense, like the common sense beliefs. They're not common sense. They're what we've been raised to believe that usually go against our common sense. Like, for example, you ask anyone in the street, do you think the King of England rapes and kills children? Well, nowadays people are more willing to, but traditionally they go, what? No. The people in authority are virtuous. That's why they're there. They're there to rule over us in a virtuous, benign way, right? You can't imagine that somebody in authority would do these things, right? That's one of the things that's drilled into the overmind, right? That we're good sheep and we go along and we'll be taken care of. And unfortunately, you get a lot of that in Canada, less so in the States.
And I would say what I've noticed too is, see, we were fringe back in the 70s, 80s. People like us, we were nut job fringe. Now we're more trusted and looked at than the mainstream media. People know the mainstream media is mainly lies, so it's like it's funny how it's shifted. So now what used to be fringe, we're actually more trusted and looked at than the mainstream media everywhere.
That's true, and that's why we say, like, it's now time for people to take the next step and say, okay, we've taken back power in our communities. We're setting up our local assemblies. We're passing our laws. We've got republic groups operating that way in 9 countries now, and people can govern themselves, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, I guess we'll close with, before I'll let you at the end, like if you want to plug, your podcast, all that type of stuff. But one good question I think would be to close with is, if there's a good message you would want to get out to the world, if you had a ton of people listening, what would that message be you would want to get out?
Well, we're at a turning point now, and if we don't separate from this murderous system and from the people running it, and stop giving them taxes and allegiance and votes and all of this stuff, and recreate the kind of society we need, restore the republic, for example, in America. If we don't do that, our children aren't going to have a future. We're heading for extermination. And this whole Neuralink thing happening, which we didn't talk a lot about, but it's a whole new step in turning human beings into cybernetic organisms, extensions of the computer mind. And then that's the ultimate extermination. Then we're gone. And our future, this is coming down, especially this year, where they're mass producing these Neuralink chips and for insertion into people. And so we're in a fight to the death. And anyone listening, you need to take a front row position in this fight. It isn't going to happen by a few people. We all need to get together, take back power in our communities. We're doing that, like I mentioned, through these common law republic groups. They're doing it all over America now in 22 states. They've declared independence from the system. Not simply Trump, but the whole corporate cabal. And so contact us. My email, I think you've got, angelfire101@protonmail.com, murderbydecree.com. You can also see our Republic website, republicofcanada.org, Kanata.
Yeah, definitely. Everybody check out all of his material. And what's your podcast name again, if you want to plug that?
I don't have a podcast at the moment, but our basic website is murderbydecree.com. We do a lot of broadcasts, and I don't know if you know the Sean Atwood show in England.
Yeah. He's got a very interesting story, that Sean Atwood.
I've had great exposure there. Millions of people watch it. But tomorrow I'll be talking about the Epstein files that are just being released, the redacted, censored Epstein files. That's on the Atwood Show tomorrow, February 5th at 11 a.m. Pacific. That'll be 2 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah, check him out on Sean Atwood. If you guys don't know who Sean Atwood is, He ties in with Sammy the Bull, and his story is very interesting because I remember watching him on. He was on Locked Up Abroad. That's where I had first caught his story. Very interesting story if you guys catch that. But I think what would be great is, like we said, down the road, maybe we can do an in studio interview, or if you want to come on here again soon to do a video interview, I would love to talk about this whole Neuralink and transhumanism thing, because I think that's going to be a very big thing. That's like the devil's final play, is to mess with God's creation by merging,
Yeah,
machines with humans.
that's right. And let's do that next time. And I'm actually gonna next month. I plan to be in the States doing a whole speaking tour, so we can definitely connect.
All right. Sounds good. So yeah, I appreciate everything, and it's been great talking to you. And like I said, I'm sure we'll talk again soon, even before in studio.
Yep.
We'll do a talk about the whole transhumanism thing.
Let's do it. Thanks, Elias. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it. You have a great day.